Good afternoon. I am very pleased and honored to welcome to our university a great personality, a man that has worked for more than a quarter of a century for the cause of peace and security in our world. Dr. Hans Blix has been one of the bravest and most judicious voices of our time on the dangers posed to humanity by weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Blix, you may know, has had a very brilliant career in academia. Then he went to serve his country in Sweden's government, and then he went to serve the international community in various capacities. After having served as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sweden in the late 1970s, he became the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, a post that he held for 16 years. And he is remembered as a very effective and brave Director General. Not only he was technically very capable, but unlike some versions in this country, he was by no means a wimp. He was a tough man at that position. Then he retired, but in year 2000, he was asked by Secretary General Kofi Annan to retire from retirement, and he became the UN weapons inspector. Little did he know that a few months or years later, he will be under tremendous pressure to address the very simple issue of Iraq. And we all know how his life was between November of 2002 and March of 2003, when he and his people conducted something like 400 inspections in 300 sites, 700 inspections in Iraq. And I remember that in a report he gave to the Security Council in February of 2003, just 1 month before the military intervention, Dr. Blix stated very clearly that he had not found any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And now we know that he was right and others were wrong. We are very fortunate to have a testimony of Dr. Blix's experience in that, at that time. He wrote this very fine book, Disarming Iraq, which has now been acclaimed in Europe and also in the United States. But you know, he never tires. And as he was writing this book, he had already accepted to chair a commission on weapons of mass destruction. And he gathered this incredible group of people from several countries, experts, to produce, and they produced this report, Weapons of Terror, Freeing the World of Nuclear, Biological, and Chemical Arms. I think the report was published only this June 1st of this year. This is something that I strongly recommend. It's an extraordinary reading. So here we are honored by his presence. He has been kind enough to accept our invitation and just help me to receive with gratitude and admiration Dr. Hans Blix.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cedillo, and professors and fellow students. I'm very pleased to be here at the university, and I think that one of the most important lessons that we can learn is to maintain critical thinking of what we see, of what we read, and even critical thinking of what we have thought and written ourselves, looking back on it. There was someone who said to me that he admired those who are searching for truth and looked with a little concern upon those who have the truth. I think that's a good starting point. Judging by the political discourse, the main threat to world security today is the possible development and possession of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical, in some states of concern. They used to be called rogue states, but nowadays the more polite expression is no states of concern. But what they mean is really still Iran and North Korea, or by terrorist groups. One might get the impression that the some 27,000 nuclear weapons, which are deemed to exist in 8 states, pose few problems, and that we need not worry about them, even though many of them are on hair-trigger alert. The International Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction, which I chaired and which presented this report in June of this year, Weapons of Terror, How to Free the World from Chemical, Biological, and Nuclear Weapons, recognizes that weapons of mass destruction, especially nuclear weapons, may be particularly dangerous in some hands, but it sees them as a threat in whosever hands they are. The Commission points out that there is not only a stagnation in disarmament and arms control since the end of the Cold War, but even signs of a renewed arms race involving new types of nuclear weapons, countermeasures to the missile shield, and the possible deployment of weapons in space. It urges governments and public opinion to wake up to the risk of this race and to revive arms control and disarmament, which paradoxically were more fruitful efforts during the Cold War. World military expenses are not going down. Last year, they are estimated to be about $1 trillion for the world, and a little less than half of that falling on the United States. In 2005, the US spent 3.7% of its GDP on defense, while Europe's NATO members were spending about 1.9% of their GDP. It is true that we do not, at the present time, see any risk of major powers using armed force against each other. World security is not threatened by a nuclear duel, which would result in the mutually assured destruction of major powers, and the rest of us probably being wiped off as collateral damage. Today's relations between the great powers are not exactly relaxed, but they're also not tense. There are no territorial or significant ideological controversies between them. All pursue the market economy of various shades and shapes, and they're all bent on pragmatism. European countries no longer see Russia as a military threat, and many states in Europe are reorienting their armed forces from defense of their own territory to the use in international peacekeeping or peace-enforcing operations. And NATO is looking for tasks outside Europe. In my own country, we have conscription, but they give preference to those who are ready and declare that they are willing to serve in peacekeeping operations. A year ago, the Undersecretary of Peacekeeping at the United Nations noted that there were less wars than there used to be, and that there were about 25 armed conflicts in the world last year, down from more than 50 during the early 1990s, and that most armed conflicts in the world today are civil wars, and that the number of people killed in battle in the world is at the present time at a 100-year low. This was last year, and it doesn't change very much this year. So these statistics sound pretty hopeful, and yet the National Security Strategy published earlier this year begins with the words, America is at war. And in the past year, we have heard President Bush say that 9/11 was the Pearl Harbor of the Third World War. Well, that is clearly not at peace. In examining world security, we can also not ignore that the US and some allied states actually went to war in Iraq in 2003, and that the political justification given was primarily the contention that Iraq retained weapons of mass destruction in violation of Security Council resolutions. While there were many other motives for the action, as we all know, it is unlikely that any of these motives and arguments would have persuaded the US Congress or the UK Parliament to authorize armed action. It shows the weight of the issue of weapons of mass destruction, and in particular that of nuclear weapons. As we know, the evidence of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction was faulty, and the reports of UNMOVIC, which I chaired, and the IEA, where Mohammed El-Baradei have succeeded me, these reports were ignored by the states launching the war. UNMOVIC had carried out some 700 inspections at 500 different sites, dozens of them actually proposed by the intelligence services of the US and UK and other countries. And we had reported no finds of weapons of mass destruction. We had also not said that there are no weapons of mass destruction. And we have been criticized for that and said, you could have spoken up, you should have said that there were no weapons of mass destruction. But then we had not kept the objective attitude. You cannot never absolutely be sure that there's nothing hidden somewhere. So you can say that we have studied, we have examined and inspected diligently, and after such and such a thing, we have not found anything. That's not exactly the same thing, but it's more truthful and more scientific than the other way. Quite to the contrary, the UNMOVIC and the IEA had publicly expressed doubts about some of the evidence that had been presented. And in private talks, as you will see in my book, I had said to Condoleezza Rice that we were not impressed with intelligence. And she answered me on that occasion that, Mr. Blix, it's not the intelligence that is being tested, it's Iraq that's being tested. And I said to Prime Minister Blair over the telephone also that wouldn't it be paradoxical if you invaded Iraq with hundreds of thousands of men and found nothing? He said, no, don't worry. Even the Egyptian intelligence has the same view as we do. So they seem to be convinced. The pleas of the majority of the Security Council that inspections should be continued were ignored, and the war was launched without any authorization of the Council. It was launched, indeed, in the full awareness that the Council would refuse an authorization. The war in Iraq in 2003 was not justified, as was the war in 1991. That was justified by a need to counter an armed attack. In 1991, Iraq had attacked and occupied Kuwait. Nor could the war in 2003 be justified by an allegation that an armed attack was imminent. It was said rather to be an action to uphold the UN Security Council resolutions, which were violated by Iraq, even though the Council majority would not accept such an action. So the authority of the Council was upheld, as it were, against its will. While the US did not officially argue that the war was justified as a preemptive action against Iraq, an Iraqi threat of attack, there is no doubt that this view was held. A US national security strategy had been published, as you might remember, in September 2002, and it flatly stated that a limitation of the right unilaterally to use armed force in self-defense to cases where armed attacks were occurring or were imminent would be insufficient in the era of missiles and terrorists. The limitations which were thus rejected were precisely the UN Charter ones, which are found in Article 51 of the Charter. The position in 2002 was confirmed in the National Security Strategy of 2006 this year, and statements that in the case of Iran, all options are on the table, frequently heard. They confirm that the current administration feels free to use force, perhaps even nuclear, there is no exception made for them, if it so chooses, without any authorization by the Security Council, and even if there is no armed attack or imminent attack. And while President Chirac, as you remember, rejected war, Mr. Sarkozy, who is now trying to become president of the United States, of France, was recently reported to have said that for him, too, all options would be open in the case of Iran. As I see it, this is a way of saying goodbye to the restrictions that were laid down with the US help in San Francisco on the use of force, at least as regards actions to stop the development of weapons of mass destruction. Whether it goes beyond that, I don't know, but at least in regard to those. Whether the freedom thus claimed from the restriction that have been laid down in the UN Charter in the interest of world security are meant to apply for all members of the UN, or only to the United States, I don't know. It could be noted as an ominous sign, however, that after the recent North Korean missile firings, a centrally placed Japanese politician Mr. Abe indeed, who is now expected to become prime minister, said that preemptive actions by Japan might become needed. So it may be contagious. Evidently, if it were to become generally accepted, the right to take preemptive or preventive strikes, armed action without Security Council authorization would be justified against anything that states might rightly or wrongly perceive as a growing threat. This is another expression that has been used. When can you use a preemptive strike? Well, when there is a growing threat. Well, that's a fairly broad criterion. And if that were to be accepted broadly, that would have a heavy impact upon the world's security. I think most governments would see this as a serious step back from what was attained at San Francisco and as a dangerous new license for big states to change the political geography. A special problem with the use of armed force that is taken preemptively or preventively, that's to say before an armed attack has occurred or is seen as imminent, is that it inevitably must be taken on the basis of intelligence, suggesting the existence of a threat. You haven't seen the armed attack. You say it's imminent, so it's intelligence that tells you this. And after Iraq affair, we know that this can be a very shaky basis on which to start a war. Armed actions against Iran or Iranian nuclear installations today, I might add, would not be in response to an attack, but only in response to a possible Iranian aspirations to produce nuclear weapons in the future. I shall come back to the case of Iran. I turn now to the efforts to prevent the spread of and secure the elimination of weapons of mass destruction by peaceful means. Efforts of this kind have deep roots. In the 19th century, determined and successful efforts were made at the Hague Peace Conferences to prohibit the use of weapons that were particularly cruel, like the dum-dum bullet, if you remember that one, as one that flattened against the body and tore its way through. And some Britisher maintained that in India, these were the only things that would stop the savages that were meeting. Well, they prohibited the some dum-dum bullet. And they also sought and succeeded in prohibiting some indiscriminate weapons, like poison and gas, which would hit civilians and military personnel indiscriminately. The threats from weapons of terror to world security has become immeasurably graver by the appearance of nuclear weapons, by the possible use of even more biological and chemical weapons, and by the emergence, at the same time, of non-state actors, terrorists who don't have a territory against which you can retaliate and who may not have the same inhibitions as most states would have. Now, how successful or unsuccessful has the world been in countering these types of weapons by cooperation and agreements? Well, first to some successes. With the arrival of the nuclear weapons, it was concluded that agreements prohibiting their use would not be enough. Prohibiting use would not be enough. Bans would have to extend to the production and possession of the weapons. No weapons, no use. The safest nuclear weapons is the one you don't have. And this led to another conclusion, namely that on-site inspection would be necessary. A use of a weapon would be visible, like gas or biological, mostly. But the production and stocking of weapons might be done secretly. Needless to say, during the Cold War, you could not get any meaningful agreements on such inspections in the closed Soviet Union. Nevertheless, in that period, neither the US nor the Soviet Union thought biological weapons were militarily useful, and after an initiative of President Nixon, a convention against the production and stocking of biological weapons was concluded, without, however, any provisions for continuous inspections, as in any case the Russians would not have accepted that during the Cold War. The absence of inspections under the B-Weapons Treaty reduced the treaty's effectiveness. Such inspections might have made it difficult for the Soviet Union to run the large B-Weapons program, which was revealed only after the end of the Cold War. And the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein might also have had difficulty in engaging, as he did, in the production and testing of B-weapons without being detected by any organization. So the absence of verification was a drawback in that convention, that early convention. The difficulty of establishing and devising an inspection system sufficiently effective to detect and to deter violations of the B-Weapons Convention should not be underestimated. It's still there. The case of anthrax is hard. We have this inspection both in nuclear, we have it in the chemical, we don't have the biological, and it would be hard, but feasible, and they have worked a lot on devising it. The case in which anthrax was sent by letters in the United States in the year 2002 and killed a number of people here has not been cleared up yet, despite the significant inspection powers and other powers which I assume the FBI and the CIA have. So even in a country with all the powers, it's not so easy, perhaps, to trace the sources of biological weapons. Nevertheless, if there had been, it might have worked as a deterrent against the Russians to do it, and perhaps also against Saddam Hussein, who knows. In the view of the Weapons of Mass Destruction Commission, the rapid development of biotechnology and the large number of potential actors call for agreement on a multifaceted international regime to give us some confidence. For first, that weapons are not made, whether by states, terrorists, or mad scientists. Secondly, that any use of B weapons is rapidly detected, if it were to occur, inter alia through international inspection. And thirdly, that national health organizations and services everywhere be ready to act promptly against the discovery of any epidemic or any use of biological weapons. Unfortunately, the measures that you need to counter, say, plague or smallpox, they are the same, whether it is an attack instigated by some terrorist or if it happens naturally. So it's the same precautions that you need to take. A review conference later this year of the B Weapons Convention offers a new chance to approach these issues. Regrettably, a verification protocol that had resulted from years of negotiations was flatly rejected by the United States at the latest review conference in 2001. And the outlook for this year's review conference is uncertain. Now, the situation is much better regarding chemical weapons. A convention on chemical weapons that had taken some 20 years to negotiate was completed and adopted at the end of the Cold War in 1993. And it is in full operation. And you might have read in the US newspapers about the actual destruction of the huge supplies and stocks of chemical weapons and the difficulties they have. It's expensive to produce them, but it's also expensive to destroy them. That convention prohibits the production, storing, and use of chemical weapons and has an elaborate inspection system. Terrorism, of course, adds a new dimension to the threat of chemical weapons and calls for stronger protection of chemical industry and better control of transports as well as exports. And I saw in the newspapers today that there was some resistance. They're discussing how this is to be gone about, and there were discussions in Congress about it, revealing that the chemical industry was not so keen to have measures in place which would protect their installations against sabotage and such things. However, it's clear that if terrorists were to attack, then a chemical industry could be a very tempting target, can be perhaps even more dangerous if it is destroyed than if a nuclear power plant were to. We remember what happened in Bhopal in India, with quite large numbers of deaths and of people who fell very ill for a long time. Now, there is no convention prohibiting the production, stocking, and use of nuclear weapons, as there is for the B weapons and the chemical weapons. Such a convention should be a long-term aim. We should aim for a convention prohibiting, outlawing nuclear weapons. Currently, most developments I think, go in the opposite direction. In an important advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice years ago, the court sees very limited scope for any legal use of nuclear weapons, mainly in situations where the survival of a state is at stake. However, even more than in the cases of biological weapons and chemical weapons, confidence that nuclear weapons will not be used will only come from assurance that they do not exist. And as there are still some 27,000 nuclear weapons in 8 or 9 countries, and a possible development of more weapons, we cannot feel that confidence today that they will not be used. So long as there are many weapons around, there's a threat. The approach to reducing the threat of nuclear weapons to world security has been to limit testing to occur only underground, the partial test ban treaty, and to prohibit nuclear weapons, the deployment of nuclear weapons in certain environments and areas. Thus, their presence was banned very early during the Cold War in the Antarctic. It was one of the first big treaties in the Cold War between the US and it was multilateral, it was not only US and Russia. And it has been prohibited to deploy nuclear weapons on the seabed and in outer space. Their presence has also been banned in a large number of nuclear weapon-free zones, and such zones now cover actually all the countries in the southern hemisphere. not the seas, because the nuclear submarines go everywhere, including the southern hemisphere, but all the countries, all the landmass of the southern hemisphere are covered by nuclear weapon-free zones. The Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, which entered into force in 1970, may be said to aim at a nuclear weapon-free world. It contains a basic bargain under which the states parties which do not have nuclear weapons promise not to acquire them, and the 5 nuclear weapon states parties, China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US, promise to negotiate toward disarmament. Today, this fundamental treaty, aiming to rid the world of nuclear weapons, is seen as having a number of problems which affect world security. First, 3 states never adhered to it: India, Israel, and Pakistan. All 3 have nuclear weapons. And 1 state, North Korea, withdrew from the treaty and declares that it has nuclear weapons. Secondly, some fear that the NPT may be falling apart because of the violations of the treaty by Iraq, Libya, and North Korea before it withdrew. And furthermore, there are suspicions about Iranian intentions, and there are concerns that the treaty is not of much help against terrorists that may seek nuclear weapons. Thirdly, the non-nuclear weapon states parties to the treaty note that despite the reduction of the stocks of nuclear weapons from the excessive levels of the Cold War, we are in a new wave of rearmament. They agreed in 1995 to extend their obligations under the treaty without any further time limitation, and they obtained, in return, a number of commitments from the nuclear weapon states parties to implement their disarmament obligations. So in 1995, the treaty was up for extension. It was concluded for 25 years, and thereafter, decision to extend it. And, of course, states could have said that, no, we will extend it for 5 years or for 10 years, but they actually went along with what was the wish of the US and many other states to extend it without any further time limitation. So they actually committed themselves to the treaty without any time limitation. And in return for that, they said, then you, the nuclear weapon states, you must also do something. And they had a long number of demands, which the nuclear weapon states went along with. For instance, through a comprehensive ban on nuclear weapons tests, and the conclusion of a convention comprising a verified prohibition of the production of enriched uranium and plutonium for weapons. These were 2 of the conditions that they saw accepted by nuclear weapon states. And more than 10 years later, neither of these promised has materialized, and many nuclear weapon states, non-nuclear weapon states, now feel cheated under the treaty. So they see an erosion of the treaty on the affected, achieved, or done by the nuclear weapon states. New nuclear weapons are being designed, and the latest military doctrines give them a wider role. In the US, there is a lively discussion about developing new types of nuclear warheads. And in the UK, the government may soon decide on a new nuclear program stretching far into this century. And in Russia and in China, they consider measures to ensure a capability on their part to penetrate the missile shield that the US is building and saying it's for rogue states, but which both the Russians and the Chinese fear that it may be aimed one day to enable the US to attack them while retaining immunity for itself. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was adopted in 1996, has remained in limbo after it was rejected by the US Senate. The nuclear haves are deepening their addiction while ever more loudly warning the non-haves against nuclear weapons. The world's main instrument for negotiations about arms control and disarmament, the Geneva Conference, has not been able to agree on a work program for over 10 years. So these are criticisms and grievances that the non-nuclear weapon states advance to say that the treaty is being undermined by these things. Against this catalogue of problems, we must also register some successes for the treaty. First, a large number of states which could have developed nuclear weapons and still could do so have joined the treaty as non-nuclear weapon states, that's say committing themselves not to acquire nuclear weapons. Among them are 3 that demonstrate that great power status is not dependent upon nuclear weapons. I'm thinking of Germany and Japan and Brazil. Mexico too. Same. Economics, the larger GDP in Brazil, I think, at the present time. Secondly, when separating from the Soviet Union, Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus handed over their nuclear weapons to Russia, and received security assurances and joined the non-proliferation treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. So that was not a foregone conclusion that it would happen, but it did happen. And thirdly, South Africa became the first state to roll back from a nuclear weapon status and join the NPT. Now, the nuclear programs in North Korea and Iran have undoubtedly relevance for the world's security today, and I will return to them now and comment especially upon them. The program for enrichment of uranium in Iran and the production of plutonium and possible enrichment of uranium in North Korea takes place in tense areas and constitute acute political problems which need early solution. In both cases, there are fears that the production of enriched uranium and plutonium may lead, and in the case of DPRK, has led, to a production of nuclear weapons that may be used. The concerns are acute, first of all, in the neighborhood of these countries, South Korea and Japan, and Israel and the Middle East. Linked to these concerns are fears about possible domino effects if they were to go ahead with nuclear weapons. The aversion to nuclear weapons is deep-rooted in Japan, and I think it would take much to provoke Japan to move to these weapons. But if, in spite of all, that were to happen, tensions with China would dramatically increase. The efforts of the US and other states taking part in the six-power talks in Beijing have wisely aimed at removing the incentives for the DPRK to develop and possess nuclear weapons. An agreement on principle was reached and envisaged that the whole DPRK nuclear program would be eliminated and strict verification introduced. The North and the South would confirm an agreement, a denuclearization agreement of 1992, that neither will have enrichment nor reprocessing plants. South Korea doesn't have either of them, but North Korea has had and still has a reprocessing plant, which I visited myself, and they claim, or it's believed, that they also have enrichment, that they got the technology from Mr. Khan, just as the Iranians did. The government of the North is further told that it may receive assurance that it will not be the subject to attacks from the outside or to foreign subversion if it abandons and if it scraps its nuclear program, all of the nuclear program. It is also told that the isolation in which it has found itself could be ended and that diplomatic relations could be opened with the United States and Japan to bring them back from the cold, if provided, of course, that they scrap the nuclear program. So I think this is a wise approach that we have taken to do away with the incentives that they have had to go for nuclear weapons, assure them about security, and assure them that if they were to scrap this program, they would be accepted in the international community. They might have to commit themselves to more than just doing away with their nuclear program, because North Korea is a country that has violated many rules of international law, and at the present time, as you may know, the US has taken some economic restrictions vis-à-vis them on the ground, on the alleged allegation at any rate, that they have been involved in counterfeiting operations about dollars. In the case of Iran, the risk of domino effect seems a little less clear. The Arab states would worry about a nuclear-armed non-Arab Iran, and so would perhaps Turkey. But unlike Japan, these states would have a rather long way to go to nuclear capability. Japan having huge stocks of plutonium and enriching uranium, they could make nuclear weapons in no time at all, whereas in the Middle East and Turkey, they are far away from it. Differently from the DPRK, Iran has declared that it only seeks a capacity to enrich uranium to supply power reactors with fuel. The IAEA and the intelligence agencies around the world has been hard at work to examine the Iranian contention, and while the IAEA has not, yet at any rate, concluded that the aim of the Iranian program is to make a weapon, others declare this conclusion with as much conviction as they showed about the nuclear weapons program in Iraq in 2002 and 2003. But it's clear that Iran also has come much further in the nuclear field than Iraq had in 2003, and that the country is not destroyed. They are at a different level. A number of circumstances are invoked to show that an intention behind the Iranian program for the enrichment of uranium is to make weapons. For instance, that the program was kept secret for very many years in violation of Iran's safeguards obligations to the IAEA, and that a research reactor is being constructed, a 40-megawatt heavy water reactor, that is an excellent producer of plutonium, It would require a reprocessing plant too to make the plutonium, but the research reactor is certainly one that would fit into a plutonium production program. And thirdly, that the design for nuclear weapon was obtained from the Pakistani scientist Mr. Khan, not only centrifuges, which they imported from Pakistan, but also a design for a weapon has been handed over. I shan't go into these and other arguments and counter-arguments about the Iranian intentions. Very likely there has not been a consistency in the Iranian program when aims during the 20 years that the country has traveled before it reached an ability to enrich grams or milligram quantities of uranium to some 3.5 or 5%. It has been shown that the roots of the program go back to the 1980s sometime. That was the time when the Iraq actually was working hard to move towards nuclear weapons. But the Iraqis by 1991 had come pretty close to enrichment. They switched from an old-fashioned method then to centrifuges. And if Iran started in the 1980s as the Iraqis did then, and only now in 2006 has reached the capacity to enrich milligram quantities to, or gram quantities to 3.5%, they must have worked pretty slowly, off and on. Very likely, there is also not a united Iranian government behind the enrichment program, but one in which various factions have various attitudes. I cannot help but feeling that it is not very meaningful at this point to search for Iran's real intention. Certainly it would be damaging to them if my work would be able to prove that there is intention, but otherwise I can't see it's very meaningful. After all, even if their intentions were purely peaceful today, this could change in the future. In a few years' time, they could change their view. So I don't see that it would change the attitude very much to Iran if we today concluded that it was peaceful, which is not done. What is certain is that Iran and any other country would be a couple of years closer to a weapons option if it were to have an industrial capability of enriching uranium. And it is of interest to note that while the concern about Iran is intense, it is part of a more general concern in the world about the possibility that more countries about which there are no particular suspicions and which are not located in sensitive areas may seek enrichment capability and thereby be years closer to a weapons option. What is very meaningful, indeed indispensable in my view, at the present moment is to consider what factors, if any, could persuade Iran to suspend, at least for a prolonged period of time, its program for enrichment. It seems to me that the European states, while they seek to convince Iran that it does not need a capability to enrich uranium, have wisely sought to demonstrate that they fully understand and endorse Iran's ambition to move into high technology generally, including nuclear. They declare themselves ready to assist Iran in this ambition by facilitating investments, offering advantages in the field of trade and finance, including support for Iran's entry into the World Trade Organization. And they also are ready to transfer nuclear technology, directly nuclear technology, for peaceful uses and assure Iran of a supply of nuclear fuel, thereby acknowledging the legitimacy of an Iranian program for the peaceful use of nuclear energy, which is important because it's also a question of status, it's a question of a developing country moving into the high technology age, including nuclear. It's a question of pride. And they are affirming that this is legitimate. What I am missing in this negotiation are two elements that only the US could contribute and that were put on the table in the case of North Korea. Firstly, an assurance about security. Merely holding out a promise about a dialogue on security in the future is not enough. And a country that may be seeing threats against them might perhaps be more likely to run for the nuclear weapons than one that is assured that they will not be attacked in the future if they stay without nuclear weapons. And the other, which was also given in the case of North Korea, would be about official, not warm, close relations, but official relations. Sometimes people see diplomatic relations as sort of gesture of friendship. No, it's not. It's a question of communicating, having a channel of talk. And, of course, many of the European countries have diplomatic relations with Iran, but the US, after the trauma of the embassy occupation during the revolution, has not had any such relations. One may assume that the Iranian government is concerned about the huge US military presence in Iraq, in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere in the region, and that the Iranians also remembers the US actions that toppled the democratically elected Mr. Mossadegh in 1953. Nevertheless, it may not unreasonably conclude that the US and Israel would be very reluctant after Iraq and after Lebanon to use military force, and that on balance it could be safer for Iran from armed attacks and subversion if it suspended enrichment than if it moved on with the program. Such a conclusion would be more likely if security assurance were part of the package offered to Iran in return for the desired suspension of enrichment. I'm not aware, however, that there had been any hint from the negotiating states about a readiness to make an offer about security assurances. Further, the Iranian government may well feel that it was treated unjustly by the industrialized world when Iran was the victim of Saddam Hussein's aggression in the 1980s, and that it has been unfairly ostracized. The US has offered to participate in discussions with Iran, provided that the country first suspend its enrichment program. And this may look as magnanimous, may not be looked at as magnanimous in Tehran as it does in Washington, where it probably took some political fighting before offering the US to participate, that US would participate in talks. In the case of North Korea, the US does not ask for any payment to sit down to a talk, but seems ready to offer normal official relations as a part of a negotiated settlement. A similar offer to sit down for talk might be a valuable chip in the game with Iraq. 3 last points. First, the Security Council of the negotiating powers have demanded that Iran should suspend its enrichment program prior to any detailed talks about what they might be given in return. Security Council resolution states that they should suspend the enrichment program before the 31st of August. And if they didn't do that, there's a threat of sanctions. But if they do suspend, then there can be talks about quid pro quos. Now, this demand of Iran to stop their program in advance may look like a technical negotiating matter, but can we be surprised that the suggestion has been consistently rejected? Which player in a game is willing to give the other side its trump card before you sit down to play? Perhaps a time-limited suspension starting at the same time as the talks would offer a way out of this dilemma, which I think has been self-inflicted by the negotiating states on the Western side. Second question is, what is the reason for the haste in the case of Iran? I do not exclude the possibility that the Iranian side wants to drag its feet and meanwhile to seek to increase its leverage by building another cascade of centrifuges, just as North Korea may increase its leverage by reprocessing more plutonium, as they have reported. Mr. Selig Harrison reported from a visit to North Korea the other day that the North Koreans were planning to take out more rods from the research reactor and send them to reprocessing, thereby saying that, well, this is what we do so long as you don't negotiate with us. And the Iranians may also conceivably drag their feet in order to put in more cascades to increase the willingness of negotiation on the other side. Nevertheless, we are told that it would be several years before Iran could enrich enough material to make bombs. There is thus, in my assessment, time for talks. Waving the sanctions card might not facilitate negotiations. It is by no means axiomatic that carrots must be coupled by the waving of sticks. The latter may simply look humiliating and provoke a national wish in Iran to stand tall. Third and lastly, there is a crying need for a revival of global disarmament efforts and a further development and respect for the UN, for the United Nations. And I saw in the newspaper this morning that the overwhelming majority of Americans feel that either the UN should shape up or else it should be shipped out. So it may not be a popular message to come with, but nevertheless, that's mine. There might be a better chance to dissuade others, including North Korea and Iran, from developing nuclear weapons if the nuclear weapon states began themselves to move away from these weapons and thereby strengthen world security and use of the UN.
Dr. Blix has offered to answer a good number of questions. You can see that there are some microphones on the side. And so who wants to start? You will start.
Do you think that preemptive strikes against nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons facilities are justified under any circumstances? And if so, what circumstances would those be?
Well, I don't think they're justified in any circumstances concerning biological weapons or chemical weapons. This has been a widening of the doctrine in the U.S., and not only the U.S., but also in other countries. I think China, I think, is the only country at the present time who says that they are categorically against any use of nuclear first strike. Now, when it comes to nuclear weapons, I don't think that preemptive strikes are justified. I mean, I go by the UN Charter, and that charter will, as we said, allow a strike in retaliation, in return for an armed attack. Now, that's clear. No one disputes that. But one has gone a little further in saying that also in the situations where the attack is imminent. Now, that goes back to a case from the 19th century, the Caroline case, which is famous in international law. But imminent, even imminent, of course, is maybe difficult to define what is meant. And it's reasonable to say that if you can see that there are missiles on their way, or if there are a fleet coming close to your shores, then you don't have to wait and sit until they get to your shore. You have to do something about it. So I can well understand the discussion that is imminent to a narrow criterion. The high-level commission that advised Kofi Annan did not think one should walk away from imminent. My criticism is rather that when you hear, if you hear it criticized in the US strategies, what is the criteria, what are the criteria they offer? And what I hear is simply a growing threat. Now, a growing threat is just total freedom. And if that is accepted by the US, well, it would presumably apply to others. So I could envisage an honest discussion about where the border goes. But I don't think there's been, I think they've thrown out the criteria there were, and without putting any other in the place.
Yeah, your question. Yeah, your question. Yes.
Cannot hear.
Huh?
Can't hear Dr. Blix speak a complete language.
I say, I'll put it closer. I'll swallow it if need be.
You didn't have a question? Okay, your question. I lend you this one.
Oh, thank you.
Professor Wisner-Raza.
You rightly mentioned that in the history of the NPT, the fact that they have also not kept their end of the bargain had weakened the incentives for those who are signed to keep on maintaining their adherence to the NPT, and the outsiders join in if they had not joined in earlier. Now, in that context, suppose Britain, for example, were to say today that we will renounce nuclear weapons. Whatever we have, like Kazakhstan did, we will give all our nuclear weapons to the United States. And we set an example by renouncing nuclear weapons altogether. That might be a good signal. See, this NPT doesn't make the notion that nuclear weapons are not legitimate weapons to use. It is not. It is simply restricting. That itself ab initio, not a right objective. So would something like this, an example of an existing have renouncing it, and would go a long way in convincing others who are contemplating not to do so?
You mean India?
India, for example.
Well, the Indian position is that they are not going to abandon nuclear weapons except in the context of others moving towards nuclear disarmament. Frankly, with the UK, there is a very active discussion at the present time. It seems that both Blair and Brown and certainly the Conservatives are intent to go on prolonging the program far into the coming century. I ask myself how necessary is this? They have promised disarmament. Do they need nuclear weapons more than Spain or Italy? Why? What would happen? I mean, they might say the French will never give it up, so why should we do it? But I think they would make a greater mark in the history of mankind if they decided, no, we let it peter out than if they prolong it. But I think they will. Their Minister of Defense came out and defended it and said, yeah, but the future is uncertain. Well, very wise words. But I don't think it's much of an argument. So no, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it would be a great thing. It would turn, and what we need at the present time is the turning of the tide somewhere. And I don't therefore hope for this one, but the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is about the most urgent. There are a number of others, but that's the most urgent.
Question, please. Yes, Dr. Blix, thank you for coming today. I'm sorry if I bungle the policy. My reading lately has been towards directed studies and not towards the news. But I would wonder how you would analyze the present policy that the United States is considering regarding Indian nuclear weapons in trading specifically uranium, or the ability to create weapons-grade uranium for a closer diplomatic tie with the country. Do you think that that's a fair trade, or that would rather endanger the world to adding one more nuclear power?
Well, we have written about a little analysis of the Indian-US deal here, which I think is rather fair, even-handed. You can look at that deal from different perspectives, and we look at it only from the viewpoint of non-proliferation. But you can also look at it from the viewpoint of energy provision in the world. Now, many of you will not agree with me, but I am a strong advocate of use of civilian nuclear power for electricity. And my friends will say, well, let's have wind power and solar power, but you're not going to have electricity of Shanghai or Calcutta satisfied by wind power. So I'm in favor of it, and also in favor very much of strengthening. I spent 16 years at the IAEA helping to strengthen the safety in the operations and safety in taking care of the waste, etc. Now, India and China is building nuclear power very fast. And they are importing nuclear power plants from Canada, from Russia, and from France. Not yet from the US, but I'm sure the US nuclears would die to sell nuclear reactors also. So the Chinese are moving very fast in that direction. I think it's fine. I should help them on the security side. That's fine. I can see that India, too, a billion people, that is desirable that they have access to the latest technology, that they be able to import this nuclear technology. So that from the point of view of energy, which we do not discuss with, we probably had different views about that in the Commission, I think it is desirable that the import can occur. However, we write, and I wholeheartedly agree, that from the viewpoint of proliferation, it has some problems, as it looks at the present time, because it would enable India to import nuclear fuel. And if they do, and if they then use their own uranium for enrichment, they can make it also for high enrichment for their bombs. The enrichment plants are not going to be under international control. So that could facilitate for them to make more nuclear weapons. Now, there would be a remedy to this, and that would be the FMCT, the fissile material cutoff. Now, that is the treaty I mentioned, a few of you will have heard about, which says that there should be a commitment, a treaty against the production of more enriched uranium or more plutonium for weapons purposes. And it has been on the books for a long time. And the US actually put forward a draft of it in Geneva very recently, but without any verification. Now, it's been on the books for a long time because none of the nuclear weapon states need any more plutonium or enriched uranium. They have so much already that they have a problem to do away and to consume it. Now, but this treaty would have also verification. And if that treaty were entered into with verification, then India, Pakistan, China, Brazil, and South Africa, and well, any country that had enrichment, Japan, well, they already have verification. They would all be party to it, and then Pakistan and China could be assured that India would not use its enrichment plants to make weapons-grade uranium or plutonium. So if the US were to move and add verification to the draft they submitted in Geneva, then I think a lot would be a lot less concern about the India agreement with India. Similarly, if they agreed with India that India should commit themselves against any further nuclear tests, well, India, Pakistan did test end of the 90s, as you remember. But India should also commit themselves against that. That would be helpful. But the US constrained to do that because they have themselves rejected the nuclear test, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Dr. Blix, I'm curious to know, apart from going actively into politics or reading your book, or something, what, if anything, can the ordinary citizen do to help free the world of weapons of mass destruction?
Well, I heard my friend John Eliasson, who was the head president of the General Assembly and who's left that now. He said in a speech at the UN that he spoke to NGOs that it takes both passion and compassion. Fine. I think you add one more, that is knowledge. But it's fine to argue out of passion, good feeling, we respect that. But if you want to achieve something, well, you need also to add knowledge. And I remember well, as a young legal assistant to Alva Myrdal in the 1960s, I was in Geneva for disarmament. And she had a lot of impact, and much of it was not only passion and compassion, it was that she relied on and engaged a lot of research workers from the Swedish military research. So when we talked about seismic events and so forth, we knew we could actually debate with the great powers. Well, not always that debate helps and that rational argument helps. But of course, it's one element. Also, public opinion is an important factor. In democratic countries, at any rate, they may listen to it. I wouldn't say that the US government was opportunistic in the case of Iraq. I don't think they listened to the masses, at least were demonstrating on 3rd Avenue out where I lived at the time. But still, in a democratic states, I think it does have a certain impact. So I would say that, yes, try to search for the truth, which is very difficult. I mean, I've been here, I used to listen to some television, and I think it's a frightfully one-sided point of view. I think even sometimes New York Times or Herald Tribune, which I read, is a little on the right side, and then I discover over here people think it's very left-wing. But it is hard. I mean, but there are lots of blogs around. I often read something called Asia Online, which has a different view and where you get other insights into what's happening. And we need that because there is a tendency in the media to run with the government. You remember before the Iraq War, how they were all running in that direction. This is a pariah, and it's clear that they are guilty. It was like the Inquisition. You know, they're guilty, just fine. The black cat is walking over, that's evidence. And the New York Times and Washington Post were at least decent afterwards to come out and say that, yeah, we have examined what happened. We found that those who said that, yes, they are guilty, they have it, they were on the first page. And the reservations, the questions, they were on page 18. Well, it's the same, works the same way in Europe. The media run with someone until they find that, no, it's more newsworthy, get more readers if they go in the other direction. Then they may turn around. So I think as citizens in democratic states, we need to try to study, to seek the truth, and also to make our views known to our people. You may join organizations, of course. I mean, as a young man, I'm not terribly embedded with any party, but I joined a liberal party in Sweden long ago because I felt that I had greater influence in politics if I could influence through a party. And I think one can, in many places at any rate. I can't give you a general recipe, but good luck.
Towards the end of your talk, you talked about how the UN needs to shape up or ship out. And I was wondering, what sorts of reforms do you suggest the UN undertake to address more modern problems of terrorism, where you have people who are attacking the United States but don't identify with a particular country or state?
Well, I'm somewhat appalled that in Europe on the whole, I think we do not have at all this view that you see developed here. I cut out from the Herald Tribune on a year ago, 13 September 2005, an article by Newt Gingrich saying, "A limited United Nations is best for America." Well, that's what is confirmed by the opinion polls today. I think that maybe the US has not come quite to terms with being the lone superpower and how to make use of the UN. They see the UN as possibly someone that can vote with them in the Security Council, that's fine, but if it doesn't do as the US, then it's irrelevant. That's what was said before the Iraq War. And somehow there is a resentment against the Security Council and the UN for not supporting the war against Iraq. And yet it seems to me that if the Security Council had voted for this intervention and said, okay, we authorize the war, what would we have thought of this council today? To authorize it on the basis of faith-based intelligence or fake-based intelligence? So I think the U.S. Security Council was wise. They did not say that they excluded an armed intervention at any stage. They simply said they wanted to have more inspections. And as I said, at the time when the attack took place, we had carried out 700 inspections at 500 different sites, and about 3 dozens of sites which had been given to us by US and other intelligence. And we told them that, look, we have been to the sites you have suggested, and there was no weapons of mass destruction. In some cases, we found conventional weapons or other things, but no weapons of mass destruction. I think, my theory is that if they had gone along with continuing inspections for a few months more, then we would have been able to say to the intelligence that all the sites that you have suggested did not have any weapons of mass destruction. And they ought to have told their executive branches that, no, we begin to doubt it. See, I was asked in the autumn of 2002, what are your gut feelings about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And I said, I am not here to tell anybody about my gut feelings. I'm here to inspect. But my gut feelings were suspicious because I had seen how they played cat and mouse with inspectors in the whole 90s. So my gut feelings were very skeptical about them. But as we went along with more and more inspections, we became more and more doubtful. And the area that, of course, was the most sensitive was the nuclear. And already in the autumn of 2002, I remember David Albright in Washington came out and expressed grave doubts about the aluminum tubes. And so did the IAEA. And we heard about the contract on the import of yellow cake from Niger. Nuclear was not my desk, but I said, why should Iran import yellow cake? It's a very, very long way from a nuclear bomb. And now there's enormous discussion about Valerie Plum and Ambassador Wilson, etc. But people do not recall that my colleague El Baradei sat in the Security Council before the war, and he came out and said, we've got a copy of the contract, and we have concluded that it is not authentic. Now that's diplomatic lingo for fake. And if he had said fake, maybe someone would have noticed it, but he said it was not authentic. It took the IAEA less than a day to see that this contract was a forgery. So I think that's relevant. That was before the war. Whatever Wilson did later on was, I think, to suggest that there was knowledge within the administration, okay. But the US government, the whole world, had been told by the IAEA that the contract was a forgery, and no one contradicted that. So these things had come before the invasion. And our feeling then about the evidence was feeling that it went down. The credibility of the evidence the evidence pointed more to an absence of weapons, and we expressed doubts. I expressed doubts about some things that Colin Powell has said, very, very courteous terms, but they tore me to pieces for saying that. Now, so our feeling was going down. At the same time, the determination went on that curve that went up. And that's where we were. It's a tragedy, but one lesson that I think we should draw from it is that professional international inspection is a desirable thing, not cosmetic. Cosmetic inspection could be worse than none, because that may lull you into a false sense of security. But professional inspection, that's what we did. And no one has criticized the quality of the inspections. That one should look at that. And the governments have the two streams of information. They have the information from their intelligence, and they have it from the inspectors. If they coincide, well, then there's corroboration, and that's fine. But if they collide, well, then they ought to say, well, hey, there's something wrong somewhere here, and perhaps correct the course. And yet I find that even after the war, there is a sort of allergy against international inspection. Not in the IAEA. They want to have more inspection in Iran and a few other places. But as I mentioned, this treaty against prohibiting the production of enriched uranium and plutonium for weapons. The US has placed on table a proposal that contains nothing about inspection. And I think that's a mistake. I think that maybe it's founded in some feeling that we are so big and we are good and everybody must believe us that we cannot have inspection. But you cannot ask the rest of the world to go for accept inspection unless you yourself do it. Now, I'm sure I might have veered away from what you asked originally. Did I answer some?
Yeah, I was. It was good, but I was more concerned with the fact that the UN deals with relations between states,
yes.
and terrorists don't affiliate with states.
Yes. Well, I get back to the UN and Gingrich. See, I think that, I mean, the UN, of course, is an organization that has many defects. It originally was about 50 states, and now it's 190 states. And there is a democratic deficit in the General Assembly, and there is another democratic deficit in the Security Council. In the General Assembly, every mini-state has a vote and a seat, and it's useful for the world to have a village council in which various voices are heard. But of course, you have the Kurds who exist. They are more numerous than the Palestinians, or maybe they're more numerous than the Israelis, I'm not sure, but they are not heard. So the General Assembly is more like a forum in which new ideas can be injected. They've done a great deal of things, and human rights started there, the law of the sea started there, environment started there, discussion about terrorism started there. So as a discussion forum, has fulfilled a great service, but it's not very operative, and it's very heavy, etc. So there are shortcomings in this. Security Council was composed of those who had the power in 1945, and that's not the group today. And you will see then that Germany, Japan, and Brazil are clamoring to get seats in the Security Council. Well, why do they want seats? I mean, is it in order to help the world and the Security Council to pursue a policy of peace for the world, or is it to pursue their own foreign policy? Well, I think if judged by those who sit there now on the permanent seats, well, they pursue their own foreign policies. And it's not really for the world. And yet, under the Charter, we have delegated, the world states have delegated to the Security Council to take decisions which are binding upon the rest of us, and which we have to implement. So they are, as it were, appointed to do it. Then they should act also, I think, with a responsibility, sense of responsibility to the rest of the world. And there's been a good deal of dissatisfaction in the General Assembly that the Council, especially the permanent members, are sort of, they take control, and there's not enough of feedback and sensing of what the Assembly, what the majority feels. You know that during the Cold War they had the so-called Acheson Plan adopted, under which if the Security Council, the General Assembly could take up a case of an armed attack, if the Security Council had been blocked by a veto. Well, that was a way of getting the world opinion working. Now, if you had the inverse happening in the case of Iraq, if someone had moved over the Iraqi issue to the General Assembly, you would have had a vast majority against the war. So the Security Council is also an institution which might stand improvement. I'm not saying that the UN is an organization that does not stand improvement, but I don't think that the biggest problems are corruption or heavy management. I mean, I've lived with the UN since 1950. Corruption is not very common. You find cases where people cheat with travel claims and so forth. That's done, all big organizations. This is petty, and no one defends it, and it should be prosecuted, okay. But if you look at the oil for food, which has been the tremendous thing here in this country, I think it has been been exploited to describe the UN as corrupt. They found, the Volcker Commission had gone deeply into it, and if anyone's interested, you have thousands of pages to plow through. And they find very little corruption there. They've expressed some suspicions against Mr. Benon Sevan, who had some money coming to him. He said from inheritance from an aunt. I don't know. But anyway, there was not much. You found some cases of corruption in procurement in the UN, which was not linked to the oil for food. But the big thing was between Iraq and those to whom it sold oil and those from whom it bought food. You see, oil for food was instituted at the time when Saddam didn't want to have it. He had very harsh sanctions that really sank Iraq. He didn't want to accept it, but the UN couldn't stand seeing all the suffering of the Iraqis. They said that we will allow you to sell so and so much oil, and eventually they were allowed to sell any quantities they wanted. But you will have to then abstain from using the money to get any weapons, and we will examine what you will buy. And Saddam said, okay, eventually. He accepted that. However, he said, I must be allowed to decide to whom do I sell the oil and from whom do I buy the food. And the UN said, the Security Council, not the Secretary General. The UN Security Council that said behind said, yes, okay, you'll do that. Now, in that construction was the beginning, the possibility for corruption, because Saddam went out and his people went out and said to oil importers in the world that you may buy our oil, but remember, 10%. Or he went around the world saying, I want to buy wheat and from you. I buy it from you, but 10%. Now, this was how, I think even billions actually were paid into huge quantity amounts of money. That was the big corruption. And I think that the oil for food people would have needed to be an FBI to see through these contracts. They did warn. There were warnings also to the Security Council. But the Security Council that was responsible did not react very much, except that they did change the calculation of the price for oil rather late in the game. So they were aware of it. But all this has been used to show that the UN is corrupt. It is not, by and large, a corrupt organization. It's heavy to manage, because if you have 190 nationalities, yeah, it's a bit heavy. It also has its charm, its attraction to be in a multinational context, and I lived with that. But sometimes I think of the UN as a sort of orchestra in which you have many instruments and many players. And of course, if some instrument is broken, well, then you can fix it. But if the players, participants, do not want to use the same tune, or if the first violinist does not want to participate, then it's hard to get a nice tune out of it.
Well, I think with that, we thank Dr. Blix for this video.